everyone, and welcome to Political Capital for all the best in BC politics and federal politics as we wrap up this federal election that no one wanted and in which nothing changed. And we're still going to talk about it because for those reasons that nothing happened. So that's one of our topics this week. Make sure that you are subscribing to the podcast. There's podcast extras. We're on CHEK Plus. We're on YouTube. We're on all of the other formats that you need. And let me bring in the pod squad here without wasting any more time so we can get right to it. Maclean K, editor of The Orca.
Thanks, Robbie, for having me. And did we have an election?
No, we did not. It's all just a dream. It's like that season finale of a TV show when it's a dream and then just the whole thing is washed away. That's pretty much it. Green strategist extraordinaire, Jillian Oliver. Hello, Jillian. Thank you for being here.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me.
And Katy Merrifield, Vice President, Wellington Advocacy. Hello, Katy.
I'm here.
Katy, you and I spent almost 3 hours live on television on election night for CHEK trying to dissect an election in which nothing happened.
We did.
It was, we look at the results and we'll get right into it because it's changing a little bit with the mail-in ballots, and then Nanaimo Ladysmith is still, at the time of recording this, still has not been declared. So, keep this in mind. But I think we ended up with around 3 more seats for the Liberals, -2 seats for the Conservatives, +1 for the Bloc, and the NDP and Green are both the same, although especially in the Green case, that's not the story at all. But essentially nothing really changed. We have another minority Liberal government. So let's go around and just ask how we view that result and what pops to mind about what we've gone through and where we are at and what happens next. Jillian, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that, there's once you start to break down the results, there are some little kind of like hints of trends here and there. A big one in BC is that the Conservatives lost ground in Metro Vancouver. I think that is a really interesting result with implications for our provincial politics. That's the same thing that's been happening to the BC Liberals. And we're seeing a couple things, such a big demographic change in the suburbs of Vancouver, younger families and different kinds of people living in those areas, as well as I think the long-term effects of the affordability crisis, which has really made people much more in favor of services. I think that childcare was on a lot of people's minds when they were voting Liberal, even though Trudeau's popularity was low. I think people were looking at, what do we need in the next 4 years and making their decision based on that, as well as climate change, of course. And I think, you see the same thing for the NDP in Ontario, where they were shut out of the GTA. So we're seeing really, the Liberals really continue to nominate urban areas, which are increasingly where the votes are. So it's hard to see that trend turning around, especially with the Liberals continuing to track left on issues like climate change and childcare.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people will sift through the Metro Vancouver votes in particular to try and find trends, because you're right, that is the battleground. Entire elections in BC, the whole election's decided in Metro Vancouver. So we have to try to understand, as you mentioned, that the demographic changes, people moving further out in order to afford homes, and that changing the dynamic of those ridings that we saw a little bit in the last election as well. Maclean, anything jump out for you at these results and the long journey to nowhere that we went on?
I mean, it's almost statistically impossible to have an election with 338 seats and come out with, what did you say, a 2 or 3 seat change for the two top parties? I mean, that's hard to do. And so, taking lessons from that is also hard to do. I think that Jillian and you are right, and that the big trend to keep an eye on here, and it does have direct implications for BC politics as well, is what you can call the urbanization of the suburbs. Places that we used to think of as, well, suburban, are increasingly not that anymore. And not only just in, the lifestyle and how they physically look, but more importantly, how they vote. The voting patterns in places like, well, not just Burnaby, Abbotsford, Langford, what we would call the 905 in Ontario, those are changing, and they're changing quickly. And these are, I think that's the long-term trend to watch across Canada.
Yeah. Katy, you've had a week to digest this. Where are you at now compared to where you were on election night?
Well, one thing remains the same. We were told at the beginning of this election by the Prime Minister that this was the most important election since 1945, and what we ended up arguably as this $600 million cabinet shuffle. So not really sure that importance really rings true today. There were a few things, though, that stuck out to me. Number one, the Liberals did secure their minority. That's not a win for them, though. They called this election specifically to get a majority, and so on that they failed. Trudeau's personal brand as well really took a beating in this election. Like the 2015 Trudeau mania days are gone. He is not going to be able to run on that once very valuable asset. And we also saw a marked change in tone from the Liberals. Like sunny ways are a thing of the past now. The Conservatives, as folks have mentioned, yes, the loss in Metro Vancouver was significant, particularly the Chinese vote collapsed in Richmond. And I think that needs some careful analysis. There's two theories out there right now. Number one is that the Conservative Party's really bullish stance on the Chinese government is what lost a once reliable vote. And the second, which is more concerning, is that there was actual direct interference from the Chinese government on those particular ridings. Obviously, one is more concerning than the other, and folks are still analyzing, but we don't have, I think, a fulsome picture of all the data yet. So this is a conversation that is still like truly the beginning in terms of lessons to be learned overall from this election.
Yeah. Where do we go from here, I guess? Let's go around again and throw out some more things on the table if you want to pick them up or take them. The People's Party has risen to 5% of the popular vote. That's triple their share last time, twice the share of the federal Greens. The Greens collapsed, including finishing behind the People's Party in Cowichan, Malahat, Langford, the home of BC Green leader Sonia Furstenau in that riding, which is deeply troubling for the Greens. I think their share of the vote collapsed everywhere, including even Elizabeth May. I mean, on paper, it looks like they got another seat, which they did, but that was because the Liberal candidate out there in Kitchener for the second Green riding kind of imploded. So putting the Greens on the table, putting the People's Party on the table, looking at what the NDP or Conservative leaders have to do now because they've sort of stalled. We'll leave the Liberals for a different round. What jumps out at any of you about those, Maclean?
The People's Party, I don't want to use the word interesting in a way that suggests that I'm fascinated by them, but it will be interesting to see if this is a temporary phenomenon. A lot of the interest you're seeing in the People's Party and all the rallies and that seem to be tied to frustration from the pandemic, from the restrictions and all those things, people protesting vaccines and vaccine passports. Hopefully, the next time we do another election, those will be issues of the past. It has been, again, I'm going to use the word interesting, to see there was an assumption going in that the People's Party would be stealing votes from the Conservative Party. I never thought that was going to be the case. The Canada's largest single voting bloc is people who don't vote, and we always ignore them and treat them as this permanent thing behind this wall we can't look through. I think that's where the People's Party got most of their votes. And polling from people like Mario Canseco suggests they also stole a lot of votes from the Green Party. And, the collapse of the Green vote probably isn't a coincidence. So that will be the thing going forward. I hope the People's Party is something that we look at like Mel Hertig's National Party. That's an obscure reference for you that, years from now, we kind of forget that it even happened.
Yeah, especially when one of their candidates was literally running with a lock her up poster with Dr. Henry's face in Vancouver Quadra, I think it was, which was absolutely ridiculous. Jillian, anything jump out at you when we put the Greens and the PPC and the other leaders on the table?
Yeah, I think, to Maclean's point about Green votes going to the PPC, I think there's definitely been an element historically of the Green vote that has been just a protest vote that doesn't really have anything to do with the Green Party and what it stands for, just that, it's people who don't want to vote for anybody else, basically. And I think that's what that's what the PPC vote is at this point. I agree. I think it'll be interesting to see if it's a flash in the pan or if Bernier and, whoever else is pulling the strings of that party can come up with more rallying cries in 3 or 4 years when we get, hopefully we'll have an election at least 3 years from now. The Greens, I mean, it's not surprising, like given what has transpired. I think that voters saw that they were more interested in their own internal politics than on serving the public. And if you want to win more votes beyond your base, you have to look beyond yourselves, and they haven't done that, and that's what they need to do now. And it'll be interesting to see. I don't see Annamie Paul running again. I was surprised. I would have expected that she would have stepped down maybe even sooner, because she had talked about that she had thought about that even before election night. going to be interesting to see, if that happens, and who steps up, who wants to take on that job, because it will be a tough one to try to rebuild that party. They do have a foothold in Parliament, which gives them some legitimacy and a voice. But I think they also really need to ask themselves, who are they and what are they offering voters beyond just being the only voice on the climate emergency, because that's no longer the case. The Liberals have a very serious climate plan. The NDP are also trying to own that issue. They're not the only game in town anymore, so they need to, figure out where they fit. Beyond that, for the NDP, I mean, you kind of hear like fractures in the NDP in terms of how they're trying to spin this result. They are the only party, I think, that increased the number of votes, but not by much. It's like 60,000 votes across the country, which is not much. And like I said, they're a shut out of the GTA, a very vote-rich area. I think there's not a lot of daylight between their policies and the Liberals anymore. I think their best bet is to try to work with Trudeau in this parliament and try to have an impact to demonstrate their value to voters, to at least hold what they have and hopefully grow in the next election.
Just before we move on from you, Jillian, because you would know better
Mhm.
than any of us, is there anything in here that the provincial Greens need to worry about when they watch this? Voters do different things federally and provincially. There's different types of voters, but is there anything there
Mhm.
that the provincial party is going to need to pause and consider?
I think the point, and I mentioned this last week, about thinking about, who are the Greens beyond climate change, is something that all the Green parties across the country need to think about. The provincial Greens have been doing that. They've also, I think there's lots of internal lessons as well, in terms of, how you engage with your membership, how you engage, with your supporters, that kind of thing. They don't have the same kind of caucus issues. Adam Wilson and Sonia Person are very close, so they don't. I think
Yeah.
the caucus management part is okay. But voters, I think, do differentiate it. There was some polling out from PEI that shows that the provincial Greens are up as of last week as the vote collapsed federally there. So I don't think that it's a huge cause for concern in terms of like the eyes of voters. But yeah, I think there's some longer term trends for them to keep an eye on for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. Katie, what are your thoughts on all of this? And obviously, you talked a lot on election night about what the Conservatives need to learn from this and where they need to go. But where are you at on that now?
Well, on the PPC, I think the citizens of Beauce sent Maxime a really strong message with, I think, 18% of the vote share, like a solid fourth place. And from what I know of that region, his father is quite a legend in the area. So if they were going to secure one seat, it was going to be that. And so I choose to extrapolate that to the rest of Canada. The interesting part of the PPC vote share is that this is obviously going to be an active conversation within the Conservative Party, which you're seeing play out on Twitter now, as to whether or not Erin O'Toole's, what I deemed like an aggressive moderate stance, is the right way for the Conservative Party to go, or whether or not there's enough folks in the Conservative Party that are angry about losing that vote share to the PPC, not necessarily on things like anti-vax and whatnot, but more on backtracking and missteps on things like gun policy, conscious rights, etc. Again, I don't think that we have that fulsome picture, but this is going to be a pretty significant moment for the Conservative Party as they contemplate the next election, which is probably going to be within the next 2.5 years. On the NDP, and I think we'll talk about the leaders probably in a bit, but I think the NDP, they need to decide, do they want to be a substantive alternative to the Liberals and Conservatives 4 p.m.? Or are they more of a movement that's dedicated to getting young people involved in politics? I think that decision needs to be made, because you're not seeing the kind of seat count that Mulcair and Layton got back in the day. They were really credible contenders, and I'm not saying that Jagmeet Singh couldn't be, but their strategy, if that is their strategy, it's not working. So I would be really interested in hearing a New Democrats perspective on this, but that's my observation thus far.
On the leaders, and we might as well bring them in here and see where we go on them. Does Jagmeet Singh survive, I guess, is a question. It doesn't, you don't hear, I mean, you hear a little bit about what the NDP maybe need to do to refresh, but not a lot. The Conservatives obviously in the middle of trying to figure that out. The Liberals still have a prime minister, but it seems unlikely he's going to go into the next election. The Greens, Jillian's already touched upon why Annamie Paul is still there. I'm not entirely sure, but the NDP seems to be the one that's most interesting where they go. Maclean, do you have any thoughts on O'Toole and Singh? Are they going to stay? I mean, it used to be you got more than one election to try. I mean, God knows Carol James tried like 3 times provincially here in BC, but it's not in this day and age. You know, you're one and done, and then you're out the door in politics, and the party blows up and rebrands. And I'm not sure what that means for O'Toole.
Well, I want to talk about Jagmeet Singh first.
You talk about O'Toole first. That's fine. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I want to follow up on Katie's point.
Okay, all right.
The 2 things can be true about the NDP. And the first is that this one thing is beyond their control. They tend to do best when there is a clear favorite for a majority government between the Conservatives and the Liberal Party. And that hasn't been the case in the last couple elections. And so the people who would vote NDP either get scared by a Conservative government or they get pulled into voting elsewhere. And so there's things they can't control there. That said, we saw a lot during this campaign of people in the NDP saying, don't judge the TikTok stuff. We're appealing to a different demographic, and you're kind of dating yourself by doing it. But as Katie pointed out, it's not working, and the votes just aren't there. And so it's fair to ask whether a video of Jagmeet Singh standing silently in a shower holding a sign does more harm than good. I mean, he is running to be prime minister, is he not? And so I think it's fair to wonder if, maybe it's funny and people like it, but they also don't necessarily see that as somebody who's going to run the country. And so, yes, I do think that the NDP, if they're smart, will look at, their tactics and strategy and maybe reevaluate there. For Aaron O'Toole, I think you're right. It would be a shame if the Conservatives became a party that just churns through a leader every couple of years, gives them one shot without a chance to introduce themselves to the public. What Aaron O'Toole was trying to do was pretty significant. He moved the party on everything from LGBTQ issues to he put supporting a price on carbon. That's going to take time. And I don't think it's a coincidence the Liberals were eager to call an election while he was still mostly unknown to Canadians. Whether he survives is purely an internal issue at this point, and there obviously, as Katie pointed out, there's a lot of discussions happening publicly that probably shouldn't be. But if I was giving advice to the Conservatives, and I'm not, I would say he's warranted another try.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially the next election will be so fascinating because we'll have reached what typically would be the fatigue point for an incumbent government, that almost 10-year tipping point where people are just done. And maybe it doesn't even matter who is there or what the platform is as much as they're just done and they're looking for a credible alternative, and can you keep them without scaring them away? And so O'Toole, would be in a really good position if he was leader in the next election, likely. Jillian, what do you think of the Conservative predicament on their leadership and then the NDP?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we talked a lot about, in the last couple of weeks about O'Toole kind of trying to put a new brand on the Conservatives as a more moderate party. I think that he did as good of a job as he could have. But I think that they're in a really tough spot, because I think that what's happened with the emergence of far right politics, especially in the States, and how much that's kind of dominated the public consciousness, as well as sort of just where the Overton window is shifted in terms of social issues. Even if, O'Toole is seen as authentically moderate, just having those voices in his caucus, I think undermines trust and is a brand problem for the Conservatives that I don't know how they can overcome that. I think you see the same thing with the BC Liberals. I guess at some point they just have to rip the Band-Aid off. I don't know, but yeah, I agree. I think that they'd be better off keeping him as leader than going through another leadership race that could be very divisive and distract from them being an official opposition.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I guess we'll watch to see in the weeks ahead how it sort of plays out. Trudeau will survive for now, but is he going to be the Liberal Party leader in the next election? Is the magic worn off? Is there any point in him does he want to stick around? I guess I don't know. So we'll watch that. We got a couple minutes left. Let's do a quick sort of hot take here. Stick with us. We have a topic in the podcast to talk about some of the latest on BC's data management with COVID-19. But for the hot take, before we wrap up here, we're going to ask the question of which comes first, the next BC election or the next federal election. We have a federal minority government that theoretically on paper doesn't have another election until 2025, I guess. But we have a BC government that on paper doesn't have an election until 2024. who knows in these crazy times when governments choose to refresh with the end of COVID and the future and all of these opportunities. So we go around really quickly. What comes first, Maclean?
Federal election. I mean, minority governments don't last 4 years.
Well, unless the NDP sees, well, you're right. Okay, that's true. It doesn't matter if their partner doesn't want the election. The main party could just wander off and do that. Katie?
I would just like to highlight I was not given an opportunity to comment on the leaders, but
Oh,
I'll forgive
sorry.
you, Rob.
Okay, we're out of
It will
time,
be
but we'll bring it up in the. You can bring it up in the audio portion.
It will be a federal election in 2.5 years or less.
Okay. Yep. Jillian?
As I've learned to prepare for the worst, I'm going to say that they're going to be at the same time.
The same time? No.
Same time.
No.
Doubleheader. Yeah.
Oh,
man.
no. What would that
Ugh.
even look like? Oh man, we got
Hell, Rob.
municipal.
It would look like hell.
Oh, wait. If we have municipal elections next year, we could have municipal, provincial, federal, school board, all just one gigantic
Park
election.
board in Vancouver. Yeah.
And we would still probably have the lowest turnout in the history of all turnouts. Because that was the other thing on this election is I don't think it was the absolute lowest, but it was certainly down there, which we all anticipated.
Mhm.
People were scared and they're anxious, and you can mail in your ballot and whatever, but still, it didn't seize people's imagination or get them out to the polls, and it was another dismal exercise in democracy, unfortunately, with with voter trends just continuing to go down. I don't know. That's a whole other topic on how we could fix that, I guess. But especially if those darn youths aren't going to come out and vote with the TikTok videos for the NDP, then we got to do something to get them up. Anyways, that's fine. Stick with us. We got some more to talk about here on BC Politics. For those of you watching on CHEK, thanks so much for tuning into Political Capital. We'll see you next week.